So Jan, I was going to tee you up and say you're going to tell us everything we need to know and how compensation committees are changed, but maybe even the title itself is changing. So let's give you the mantle.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and increasingly calling the compensation committee is a bit of a misnomer. We have seen the expansion of the compensation committee remit get both broader in terms of the types of things that they're paying attention to, but also deeper, paying attention to more than just the senior leadership in the organization, but really looking at the entire human capital spectrum. I will pile on some data to add to what Dave started us out with. If you look at the S&P 500, we are now at 49% of the S&P 500 have changed their comp committee name to be something that signifies a broader perspective or a broader remit. And if you go and actually open up the charters to see what does the compensation committee say they have responsibility for, that expansion is even wider. 84% of the S&P 500, if you read their charters, have at least one sort of non-traditional item that they have put into their responsibility of the comp committee, even if they haven't gone so far as to change the committee's name. And those areas of additional responsibility tend to be succession planning. And by succession planning, I mean succession planning that goes deeper than the traditional CEO only or CEO and CEO direct reports, but it's C-suite plus one, C-suite plus two that companies and committees are paying attention to. And along with that, the related talent development and pipeline for those committees, for that succession. The other area that a lot of committees are delving into and paying attention to is DE&I and the whole issue around employee engagement, corporate culture, and it's not so much trying to take over and do a land grab to take over become a shadow management team, as much as it is just both querying management around the policies and procedures that are being put in place to deal with a really rapidly changing workforce landscape, but also being available to the management team as a sounding board and a group of diverse perspectives to help the management team with the problem solving of these issues that we've never come across before. Now, the kind of conundrum in there is that while everybody says, human capital, our people are our biggest assets, and comp committees are taking on all of these deeper, broader responsibilities with regard to human management, what you find is if you look at that skills matrix that Dave was talking about for board members, and we go back to our S&P 500 again, less than half of the S&P 500 includes in their skills matrix a separate category for human resources expertise, human capital management expertise. There seems to be this notion that somehow a CEO, by virtue of the fact that he or she has been a CEO, is a compensation expert or a human capital expert. And I am here to tell you they are not. So
if we were all CEOs, would you tell us the same thing, Jan?
I would. Yes, I would. I would tell you you are good at very many things, but you are not an expert at compensation. So as boards look to think about, and this gets to some of the overlap that you were talking about, Dennis, between the committees, as boards start to think about the valuable real estate sitting around the boardroom table, and you want to allocate a seat for the cyber expert, and you want to allocate a seat for the financial expert, and you want to allocate a seat for a digital economy expert. I'm going to make a plug for allocating a seat for a human capital expert.
Well, that seems like a pretty good allocation. Your stats were pretty interesting. The one thing you didn't, at least I didn't hear you say, maybe I was writing a couple notes, but you didn't say anything about pay versus performance, which seems to be the new hot topic. And I don't know what box I ought to put that one in, but talk to me a little bit about that one.
Sure. That is only one of a whole variety of new regulatory things that management and comp committees have to deal with. So I will rattle through these in no particular order. These all fall into the category of boring but important. So the SEC, we've long awaited under Dodd-Frank. There were a couple of things that had yet to be implemented from Dodd-Frank, which was adopted, more than a decade ago. One of the outstanding things was the pay versus performance disclosure. The SEC finally came out with the final rules on that this past summer and said, oh, by the way, companies, you have to comply with this in your 2023 proxy season, which put everybody into a tizzy. It is a ton of work. For those of you who are public companies, we're far enough along in the season that you've actually probably already seen presentations and maybe even drafts of the disclosure. So I won't go into detail on that. I would just say, in terms of things to think about from a committee perspective or board perspective, there is a hope by a lot of people that this PVP disclosure will go the way of the CEO pay ratio disclosure and will simply become one more compliance thing that gets dumped into the very end of the proxy statement. I think the extent to whether or not that happens largely depends on what ISS, Glass Lewis, and institutional investors end up doing with that data. They have said, ISS and Glass Lewis have both said that for 2023, they are not going to use this new disclosure to affect their methodology or their say on pay recommendations at all. But that may not hold true in future years. If they somehow decide that these numbers matter, then these numbers will matter. The other thing that is noteworthy is while management has been spending a lot of time on the primary table that does the compensation actually paid calculation, we've heard comments from some institutional investors that they are actually far more interested in the secondary table, which is the listing of the metrics that companies deem to be important to determining executive compensation. And that institutional investors have suggested they are far more interested in the signaling that a company puts forth by what 7 items do they put on that list than they are in the actual cap numbers in the primary table. So take that as food for thought. The other kind of regulatory stuff that's swirling around out there, to just touch on briefly, clawbacks. That was also kind of a remaining item in Dodd-Frank. The clawbacks we are waiting for the SEC adopted rules. We are waiting for the listing standards to come out of both the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. Those listing rules are expected to be finalized and disclosed and are released next week. at which point then companies will have to comply. So compliance will be sort of towards the end of 2023 in terms of a date. The thing to know about the clawback rules is it is only for financial restatements. It applies to both big R restatements and little r restatements, and it is mandatory. Most companies' current clawback rules give the company the right, but not the obligation to claw back compensation if it's deemed to have been inappropriately paid. This new rule, the SEC's new rule, you no longer can have the discretion to choose not to go after the money. You have to go after the money. So what the current thinking that I'm hearing is that most companies are going to adopt a layered approach to clawbacks, and they will keep the current clawback policy that they have that applies to usually a larger group of folks, and also tends to include non-financial reasons for clawback like bad behaviors. And they will layer on a new clawback rule that is SEC compliant, but is very limited to only Section 16 officers. Third item on the regulatory front, 10b5-1 plans. 10b5-1 plans actually go into place immediately. They're effective next week. And the new 10b5-1 plans, which is the kind of programmed trading rules, are much, much, much stricter than the old rules. Most notably, there is a 90-day cooling off period. So if you were to go to your broker and say, I'd like to implement a 10b5-1 plan, the first day that anything could be traded under that plan is 90 days from now. You also cannot have overlapping 10b5-1 plans. So once you put a plan in place, that's the only 10b5-1 plan you can have until you cancel that one and put in a new one and wait a new 90 days. So it is much more restrictive than the old plans. The other thing about the 10b5-1 plans is there is a new heightened level of disclosure. For anybody who's sitting on the audit committee, and this will be a lead into Stephen, there will be a new disclosure in the Qs that has to list all of the 10b5-1 plans that were entered into over the past quarter or that were canceled over the past quarter. So a much higher level of disclosure, a much more strict definition of what qualifies as a 10b5-1 plan. Next item I want to touch on, I only got two more. So the next item is the FTC, not to be left out. This has put in place a vote in early January on a national ban on non-competes. This rule is very, very broad. It would be a sea change in the way we manage employment contracts and executive retention issues, because it would eliminate the use of non-competes. You wouldn't be able to put in garden leave programs. You wouldn't be able to have very broad non-solicitation agreements. You wouldn't be able to put in standstills for, say, for example, Pearl Meyer. An engagement letter with us says, for the pendency of our relationship, we promise not to steal your people if you promise not to steal our people. That would have to be, we couldn't do that under these proposed rules. So we expect that this will be face many, many, many lawsuits, beginning with, does the FTC even have the right to do this? Or are they playing way outside of the boundaries? And even once you get to there, even if they decide the FTC does have the right to do this, this proposed rule is so broad that it will not go into effect as written, but we could get some version of this that would still have significant implications. The last thing I will mention is, as of January 1st, there was a survey that was done by Paychex that stated that as of January 1st, 1 in 4 employees in the US now lives in a jurisdiction where pay transparency laws are in place. This doesn't necessarily change compensation programs, but it does change the way companies need to think about how they talk about their compensation programs with their employees. We always do things, behind closed doors that we might not do if it was in the light of day. Assume now that all of your compensation decisions are made in the light of day.
Fun stuff, huh, Jan?
Oh yeah.
Must be the Full Employment Act for.
It is absolutely our Full Employment Act.